Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Daisy Dunn. I'm Carbon Brief's special correspondent, and I want to first apologise for the slight delay to this webinar starting, but I can see that everyone's joining the call now, so that's great. Our webinar today is the topic, how can carbon offsets be reformed? So all this week, Carbon Brief has been publishing a range of explainers, investigations and analysis into carbon offsetting. So put simply, carbon offsets involve an entity that emits greenhouse gases into the atmosphere paying for another entity to pollute less. So for example, an airline in a developed country might want to claim it's making emissions reductions by paying for a patch of rainforest to be protected in the Amazon. The idea is that this can be an effective mechanism for polluting countries and companies to give money to projects that are good for the planet, especially in the developing world. However, a series of high-profile investigations and scientific papers have shown that many carbon offset projects vastly overestimate their ability to reduce emissions and can come with devastating consequences for Indigenous communities and local people. This is something that we've been exploring all week with our carbon offset series, and we're going to be discussing it today with a wide range of experts from around the world. So I'm very pleased to introduce my colleagues who will be moderating this session. So my first colleague is Josh Gabatis, who is Carbon Brief's policy correspondent. And my second is Molly Limpari, who's Carbon Brief's policy section editor. And just a couple of housekeeping notes. We have about an hour for this session, and we're going to start with some brief introductory remarks from our speakers, and then we'll move over to a Q&A of the audience. During the session, please use the Q&A box, not the chat box, and we'll try to get to your questions. So thank you very much for joining us. I'm going to disappear now. Goodbye.
Thanks, Daisy. And yeah, it's great to be joined by four fantastic panelists. I wonder if, Barbara, if you could kick us off by introducing yourself and sort of responding to how can carbon offsets be reformed? I think you're...
Hi, so I'm Barbara Haya. I'm a research fellow at the Goldman School of Public Policy at UC Berkeley, and I direct the Berkeley Carbon Trading Project. And to answer the question, how can carbon offsets be reformed? I don't believe they can be reformed as carbon offsets. So I've been studying carbon offset quality for over 20 years. From the Kyoto Protocol's offset program, where we and others documented a large majority of those projects most likely would have gone ahead anyway and don't actually reduce emissions, to California's offset program, where the methods for estimating emissions reductions are systematically overcrediting, to the voluntary market, where I and others have had a hard time finding projects that are confidently not overcredited and methodologies that are not allowing for significant overcrediting. The level of overcrediting is really significant. We're not talking 20, 30% overcrediting. We're talking 5 times, 10 times, 12 times overcrediting. And these credits are being used instead of companies making direct emissions reductions, they're being used to sell carbon neutral flights and fuel. And overall, we just released a major report on red offsets, avoided deforestation, which is the project type with the most credits on the voluntary offset market. And I and this team of researchers found really 2 different things. One is we were surprised to see overcrediting really under every rock we turned. And then 2, what we looked to try to understand why there was so much overcrediting. And we found that the methodologies, is this too long? Should I, is this okay? Okay. We found that just a little bit more. We found that the methodologies offered significant flexibility to developers in how to estimate emissions reductions, that the developers, of course, when there's uncertainty, were making choices that led to more credits rather than less credits. Why would they not? And that the third-party verifiers that were hired by the developers to review the carbon calculations were not doing their job ensuring that the choices were conservative. And often they didn't ensure that they were reasonably accurate or reasonable. And our team ended up concluding that the offset market is structured to overcredit because everyone involved in the making of an offset credit benefits from more credits. And you get large quantities of overcrediting because decisions along the life cycle of the offset program, or the from the writing of the methodology to the buyers who want cheap credits, it's a compounding of decisions that lean towards overcrediting, which is why we get these very large quantities of overcrediting. So in the end, I will argue that we need to move away from offsets. I don't see a way to fix this market. And I think what we need to do is move towards a contributions approach. For one, we need to move away from offsets and double down on prioritizing reducing our own emissions. And then we need to create easy ways for those who want to do more to find projects and programs to support as contributions, but not as offsets.
Thank you, Barbara. That's a really great intro. Next, we'll move on to Kaya Axelson, who is a net zero policy engagement fellow at the University of Oxford, and one of the brains behind the Oxford offsetting principles, which is I'm sure Kaya can explain to you now. Kaya, would you want to give yourself a little intro?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be on this panel with people's work that I've been reading for a long time. And I want to start out by saying that we at Oxford titled them the net zero aligned Oxford offsetting principles, kind of as a grab, but really to highlight actually how little of the market is providing a net zero aligned offsetting option. Looking at Dr. Haya's own database and looking at how little, and you've commented on this in your work, Josh, just looking at how little of the voluntary carbon market has any credible removals in it at all, let alone removals with long-term storage, suggests that most of the market is not fit for purpose to balance sinks and sources on a basic level. And then if you look at the incredible amount of emissions reductions, offsets in the market and their quality, it's not a market reform problem, as Dr. Haya has pointed out. It's a question of the projects themselves and what they're selling and the incentive structures to keep prices low and to exploit communities for their ecosystem services if they are kind of removals through forest projects. I think facts and stats are as important as stories. And I was at COP last year and I was sharing a hotel room with the Ecuadorian indigenous community who were there to ask for their money because they hadn't been paid for many, many years for the services that they'd been providing. And so we have to consider how markets continue to exploit people and how middlemen get paid for these kinds of projects, but that sometimes that money doesn't trickle down. Do I think overall that, if all the projects in the market are bad projects? No, I've talked to a lot of really amazing projects about the work that they're doing, the co-benefits they provide. And I wouldn't want all those projects to go away just because I think that the market is broken and, and it's not delivering on what it promises. And so I think I agree that we need another way to incentivize and transition some of the amazing work that's going on the ground. I guess what I would say is that there's a few things that we highlight in the Oxford offsetting principles. That there's the issue of the need to invest in things after, or not after, but as alongside deep emissions reductions as like the first principle. I think everybody knows that. But then as your piece points out, a huge amount of those who are paying for offsets now are those industries that are, as we know, not making those deep cuts. So the fossil industry and the
It looks like Kaya is having
almost as much as we can kind of in our scope one Oh, can you hear me?
Sorry, you cut out for a moment there, but you might want to just repeat the last 20 seconds.
Yeah, so there's an interesting angle here as well about the budgets of some of these very large companies that are investing in offsets or rec credits for their scope 2. And if you look at them, I mean, some of these large companies have billions in their sustainability budget, which is great. We want to keep that money in that sustainability budget. But is investing in market-based mechanisms the right approach for those companies? What if those companies invested billions that they have in their budget in decommissioning all the coal facilities in the US? Directly, as opposed to working in through a market that has many middlemen and that has, the potential to have low additionality in some of the projects. Why don't we start from an outcomes-based framework in sustainability in terms of what we want to achieve? We've all agreed internationally it's time to phase out coal, but we haven't delivered. So what if, a company was like, that's the best thing that we can do to reduce scope 2 emissions for everybody is invest a ton in decommissioning coal facilities. And then let's look at our next order priority. What do we need to get done as a community? I think I'm really excited by some of the aggregated purchaser coalitions that I'm starting to see as an alternative to traditional carbon credit and offset markets. So I'll stop there because there's lots more to discuss.
That was really interesting. Thanks, Kaya. Our next panelist is Laura. I wonder if, Laura, you could introduce yourself and just quickly answer our key question: how can carbon offsets be reformed?
Thank you. I'm Laura. I'm from Guyana, from the Amerindian Peoples Association, an Indigenous peoples advocacy organization. So how can carbon offsets be reformed? Our experience in Guyana as an Indigenous peoples rights advocate, our experience shows that if Indigenous peoples are not made center and included in national decision making, it is in the design of what we may want to be involved in the whole carbon trade, it is not going to be effective other than to mislead Indigenous peoples to feel that we're going to get all of these monies, but really not understanding of whether we should be or we would like to be involved and whether we should give our consent to being included in carbon trade such as this. So how should that be reformed? First and center, it has to be government, a combination of government, the financial sector, and Indigenous peoples, who are all, especially for Indigenous peoples, to be very much respected and considered as the ones driving this. And that can only happen if Indigenous peoples are informed that we can properly participate and give our consent to the design and implementation on progress.
Fantastic. Thank you, Laura. That's great. Some really interesting different perspectives coming in here. Finally, our fourth speaker is Pedro Barata, who's the Associate Vice President of Carbon Markets at the Environmental Defence Fund, and also co-chair of the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Markets. I think I got that right. It's one of the various initiatives to examine and think about ways in which the voluntary carbon market can be done better. And again, I'm sure Pedro can fill you in on all that.
Great, Josh. Thank you for the introduction. Let me just correct you on one point. I'm not the co-chair of the Integrity Council. I'm the co-chair of the expert panel of the Integrity Council. So one floor below the council itself. But I am sort of representing ICVCM in this context. So the first thing I wanted to say around the question as it's put, I want to correct a little bit the question or clarify the question. The question has been put as how carbon offsets can be, what is it? The actual question is, how can carbon offsets be
formed?
Right. So what we're talking about most of the times is carbon credits. In my very simple world, you either have, as carbon units go, you either have allowances from emissions trading systems or carbon credits from baseline and credit systems. When you say offsetting or offsets, you're referring to a particular use case, which is a compensation claim on the demand side. So I think it's important to understand what is the debate here going to be about. Is it about carbon credit quality? Can it be reformed? Or is it about the use claim of offsetting? Is it fit for purpose? I have views on both, but let's start with carbon credit and can it be reformed? I remember, like Barbara, I was heavily involved in the CDM. I was part of the executive board for a number of years. And we did, to an extent, reform the system. But I acknowledge, with Barbara, that there are inherent difficulties with accrediting framework. For example, you need to take care of conflicts of interest. You need to align the regulators and the regulatees on a common purpose. And oftentimes, you'll see that if you don't have that alignment, you'll see that you have abuse, let's put it this way, of the position of those who, the third-party validators, for example, will be more inclined to take a pass on checking the quality of credit if there isn't a strong regulator in place. So in a way, I do share, I'm not exactly on the same page with Barbara in particular on her analysis or scientific analysis. I wouldn't dispute it because I'm not the scientist here. But I do share the concern that without a strong regulatory framework, you do have a system where it's everyone for themselves. Nobody checks the quality. The buyer and the seller are both, let's put it this way, with a shared interest in perverting the system. But you can change things. So to take one notorious example under the CDM, we had this huge problem of HFC 23 overcrediting that we found. First of all, it wasn't independent research that found it. It was actually the regulator that found it. It corrected the mistake to the point that for a number of years, HFC 23 projects were actually undercrediting. So they were, in fact, providing, without the benefit of the Kyoto Protocol being enforced, they were providing for a number of years actual mitigation contribution, if you want, or a net zero, whatever you want to call it. So would agree with Barbara again on that flexibility. I do not agree, just a very quick point, if there's a new mitigation contribution approach, I would hesitate to say that is in any way different in terms of the demands that we should have on the credits and the quality. In other words, if I'm going to replace an offsetting claim with a contribution claim, I don't see any reason why we should be laxer on additionality, laxer on validation, verification, etc. And oftentimes I see NGOs that are coming forward as mitigation contribution saying, oh, well, and you know what? It would be easier, for instance, we could actually relax a little bit on our additionality, on our permanence claims. Sorry to say, I don't see it that way. Even if you're just in the scope of contribution, I would hesitate to do that. And finally, on this potential conflict between offsetting and the frameworks and the idea that offsetting gives a free pass to companies. First of all, there are now other initiatives like the Science-Based Targets Initiative that is inherently about that, making sure that we can trust the trajectories and the pathways that companies are going on in terms of net zero. And there's also evidence that those companies that commit to those pathways are both reducing internally, and that the companies that are reducing most internally are also the ones that are buying the most credits. And there's recent research to that in terms of surveys and actual cross-checking of that. Now, I'm worried about credit quality very much, and that's why the ICVCM has been set up. And we do hope that over the next few months, we'll be able to change significantly the landscape of carbon credits. So I'm not as disparaging, put it this way, on those prospects as I think Barbara was indicating she was.
Thanks, Pedro. And yeah, it's great to have different opinions from so many different experts, which hopefully should make this a very lively discussion. To sort of kick us off, you sort of fed into it quite well, Pedro, but who should lead in reforming carbon offsets? Should it be registries, should it be governance bodies, or buyers themselves? Barbara, I wonder if you could kick us off with an answer to that.
So, yeah, I think the distinction that Pedro was just saying about, well, you can have offsets and you can have contributions that are also credit-based, but then you can also have contributions that are not credit-based. So I think the answer is all of the above, meaning for the credit-based contributions, we need, buyers who care about quality. We need ultimately the registries. They're the rule writers, and they need to rewrite the rules so that over the portfolios of projects we're not over-crediting. You need strong governance to help ensure that claims can't be made based on false credits, and to support quality. And I think we also, all of the above needs to be thinking about an alternative to the current system, an alternative contributions approach that's not based on creating a set of rules and letting the market go, but is based on, as Kaya was saying, a focus on looking at where funds can really make a difference, and programs that companies and others can support to do those things, where you move away from the issues of quantification and additionality, et cetera, into putting money into places where we know that money is really needed and can make a difference.
I feel that we're talking about kind of contribution approach, and it's something that a few of the questions that have come in have asked about this and whether this could be a sort of viable alternative model. So I wonder if maybe someone could just come in and just kind of explain in more layman's terms what this would mean in the sort of grand scheme of carbon offsets. I know, Kaya, you said that you were interested in speaking to this, so perhaps you could just explain briefly what that would mean.
Yeah, this is a really live topic. I'd actually love to hear from the other panelists on this as well, because it's something that my team is doing some thinking and research on. How do we reform the standards and policy landscape so that we can give companies a place to talk about some of the good that they're doing without shoving those things into inventories? I think, Pedro made an important distinction between an offset and a credit. Right? An offset is something you use to say, we've done some bad emissions over here, and we want to, say that we've taken down emissions in a 1-for-1 balance. And there's been a lot of criticism of that type of maths. But that's because we've really only given companies their greenhouse gas inventories as a way to talk about their effect on society in terms of, helping us meet the global net zero goal. And it's my view that we need to give companies a separate kind of incentive structure to talk about their contribution in wider society. This is representing a fundamental shift in how we think about companies as like strict legal individual entities, or rather players in a wider system. And so I'm kind of working on a paper talking about going beyond inventories into intervention.
Kaya froze.
Perhaps their policy and advocacy, perhaps their systemic interventions. They're working in, someone in the chat was asking about these kind of aggregated demand coalitions. That could be something like the LEAF Coalition or this new Frontier Coalition. It's when companies get together and they say, we're going to, as purchasers, say that we're going to invest in these service we agree on, and it kind of deeps the investment for companies or innovators who need to create that service. So these are kind of alternatives to your typical credit approach. And I think that these types of systemic interventions, or even investing in your own product innovation so that you have avoided emissions as a result of your investments internally that wouldn't necessarily fit into your scope 3. These are all things that we need to give a place for companies to talk about as their kind of contribution to, global net zero. So there's your personal net zero goal, and then there's your kind of global net zero contribution. I don't think we've figured out exactly how to incentivize those structures yet.
Would anyone else like to speak to this question?
If I may, I do have comments on both Barbara's and Kaya's. Barbara, I think you're saying at some point that we should move to a contribution claim where companies can say, and then you said, and I noted down, you can show that you can make a difference. So that goes back to my point. If you have to show that you're making a difference, that is essentially, it doesn't matter whether you're quantifying or not, but that's essentially about additionality. What you don't want globally, we have scarce resources. So you don't want globally is for a lot of companies to say, hey, I'm contributing to the Amazon, or I'm contributing to whatever, and yet not having some mechanism by which you say, well, how is it different from the thing that you're contributing to or that you're financing, how is it different from whatever was happening? This applies for everything we do, whether we're talking about policy level, jurisdictional approaches, project-based. So I think that the point being here, to me, from a quality perspective, I don't think a contribution claim is anything different from, or should be anything different from what we are trying to get in terms of a crediting claim. Then the other thing I would push back a little bit on, sorry for being so contrarian, is this notion that because the world as a whole needs to get to net zero by as soon as possible, but by 2050, let's say, that a company should now be prevented, whether it's contribution or offset, whatever the claim may be, from investing in reductions beyond their value chain. I see, or the idea that somehow we should be promoting removals at the cost of reductions. We don't have right now enough mitigation to go around, just globally. So I'll take whatever mitigation I can get, if it's, again, credibly checked, verified, etc. I'll take any reduction, and yes, I will take any removal as possible. But right now, the technological cost of tech-based removals, for example, is several factors of magnitude higher than the cost of emission reductions. And so I don't see any particular ethical problem with saying to companies, do your best internally, do your science-based targets, and then go out and buy as many emission reductions. And whatever you want to claim, I mean, that's a separate exercise. You can claim it against any type of do-gooding, but I don't see that should stand in, that our focus on removals at some point in net zero, in global net zero, should stand in the way of emission reductions right now.
Laura and Barbara, you both have your hands up. Laura, I wonder if you want to go first.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I wanted to add to, how do you do that? So for Pedro and for both Barbara and Pedro, I think our situation in Guyana lies somewhere in between. Guyana has this jurisdictional approach there, but what we have experienced is that with even standards that are there, because standards have been designed without indigenous peoples, at least in the case of Guyana, indigenous peoples not knowing what these speak to, not knowing what a good appeal process or a complaint or appeal process may look like, it has taken away from indigenous people's rights in the case of being involved and being able to access these properly, and even understanding what this actually means in the case of what jurisdictional approach means, or what it means for indigenous people's rights, or for us to be included. I don't know if I wanted to quickly, I was trying to see how I can sorry. I was trying to see if I can quickly bring up this map of Guyana to show you why it's such a different setting where the majority of the population live along the coast of Guyana, which is non-forested. And that is not indigenous peoples. The indigenous peoples that make up like 12% of just around 800,000 Guyanese live in the forested highlands, in the savannas, in the waters. So it really is a lands of indigenous peoples and territories that we have been living on, protecting, and everything else. So, and the hinterland of Guyana, we've had very little connectivity to be included, like internet is limited or no internet connectivity. So it has had these challenges where indigenous peoples have been left behind in being fully and participatory in all of these decision making and the design of what Guyana has been offering, and now what the credit sale has been so far. Going forward, how might we look at this? It would be constantly calling for a combination of approach where we have, as I said, governments, indigenous peoples, the financial sector, and especially, as we're also saying, academia and research that provides and supports indigenous peoples' positions, our concerns, and our contribution and input toward successful, if it can be successful, reforms and decisions.
Barbara, do you want to finish off that question?
Sure. And yeah, I really appreciate what you just said, Laura. I thought it might be helpful to distinguish offsets from contributions. So this might be helpful. Is I think fundamentally what a contributions approach means is that you're not netting out your total emissions. So just very fundamentally, with offsets, you can claim net zero if you emit and you buy credits. With a contributions approach, you can't say or claim a net number. You have to claim what you've emitted or maybe what you've reduced directly, and then you can say another number of what you've done otherwise. And I think that we can think of contributions as maybe two different types. One is contributions that are offsets where you just are making a different claim, sort of based on the carbon credit. And what I'm really most excited about exploring as a contributions approach is going a step further and not using the current offset market, but developing alternative ways, or companies already have alternative ways to support climate mitigation that's not necessarily through the offset market. And I think for many reasons that can be more effective than what we've seen so far with carbon offsets.
It's really helpful to have those clarifications. I know both Pedro and Kaya have their hands up. I am slightly conscious that we've got about 20 more minutes. Are there quick points that you'd both like to make, and then we'll move on to some of our questions from the audience?
Yes, just on Laura's point and her experience in Guyana, just to say on behalf of the ICVCM, and first of all, my personal experience in these markets is that if there's something even worse than the environmental integrity problems that Barbara is talking about or has researched at length, is sometimes the claims of social and to be honest, even human rights violations on the back of things like CDM projects. And I wouldn't want to be in a market, put it this way, that has this taint on it. So one of the things that I think is really important is that I think over the last 10 years, we've seen a major shift from this focus on environmental integrity alone being about additionality and permanence and getting the emissions accounting right, to broadening a bit the idea of environmental integrity and broadening it to social integrity, making sure that people on the ground are respected, they are getting the benefits. And just to note that the ICVCM has these as core carbon principles as well, environmental and social safeguards. And then on top of that, we are putting together a an IPLC, Indigenous People and Local Communities stakeholder forum. I hope, to be honest, and this is an internal message, I hope that this is not just a window dressing or anything. I do hope, and I feel that commitment from other people within this, that we are really there to listen to these Indigenous peoples, to their experience, and making sure that we can work to address some of the very basic shortcomings with respect to their participation. So just this pitch for the ICVCM work.
Yeah, I just want to add that I think the biggest ethical problem with the offset market is that we think of it like a market, and it's something where we could just go buy something and then forget about all of the benefits that we're claiming that it supposedly is attached to. A friend of mine once said, offsets are like pets. They're not just for Christmas, they're forever. Once you've claimed this benefit, you have to be paying attention to it. You have to be thinking. And I think the biggest danger of us thinking about it in this kind of consumerist way is that companies, it's true, Pedro has said that it's the companies that are, kind of better in, and let's be clear, no company is doing what we need it to do at the moment, like in terms of its net zero. You can look at the net zero tracker and see its progress. But it is the companies that are better that are investing the most in credits. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be thinking, what could they be doing more, or what could they be doing instead of that? So I think it's kind of like a lazy approach potentially to just be like, oh, I've invested my credit and it's retired and then I'm done. I've washed my hands of it. Additionality is something you have to be like very watchful of. Permanence, that the most recent, and Pedro, this is something I'd love to pick up with you, but the most recent documents I've seen from the ICVCM list permanence at a very kind of low bar and in terms of very kind of short-term timescales. And we know carbon lasts in the atmosphere for thousands of years. So I'm very concerned about the permanence element. And that's something that, if things don't work out with a project and we've claimed removal with storage, then it gets re-released, then the company needs to reconsider if it has claimed a net based on that, whether it is still net zero. And so companies have to be diligent even after they've purchased and retired the credit, right? They have to be paying attention. So that's why I really like kind of Barbara's perspective that we need to have a fundamental shift in the way that we're thinking about these projects that we're investing in. We need to kind of curate them and take care with them, make sure the communities, to Laura's point, are involved on an ongoing basis. We can't just buy and then be comfortable letting that go. And then I think that there's another really important ethical issue about who gets to offset and where and why. And ultimately, to answer your question originally, Josh, the people that need to be fixing these markets, I think it needs to be regulated, because right now we do have a really big problem. I mean, I don't know if you guys just saw, but the UAE has just invested a huge amount to, and the headline was, that Liberia has conceded territory in the amount of 1 million hectares to the UAE to do whatever it wants in terms of offsetting. Now, that is just fundamentally wrong if we think about what that land could be used for, the local people, and how they kind of get to decide what they want to do with their land. And the UAE's emissions are fossil emissions that probably shouldn't be offset through, nature-based offsets in another country. And so or sold. And so we have, I think, a fundamental issue of integrity that is going to need regulation. And I'm just not so optimistic that our voluntary frameworks have gone far enough or can go far enough to fix that.
Thanks, everyone. This is proving to be a very spirited discussion, as we predicted. Thank you for all your perspectives. I'm going to try and crack on with a few of the questions coming in from our audience now, because there have been quite a few. So a lot of people will be familiar with offsetting through the various investigations that have been done and have been widely publicized in news media. A lot of these are focused on REDD+ projects, which are sort of forest preservation projects, which are then used to generate offsets. So there's a couple of questions coming in about REDD+. One is, are your concerns only about REDD+ projects or also about others? And the other is about what will happen to REDD+ projects that depend on carbon financing. So I guess the implication there is, if this market was discredited, what would happen to those projects? I guess any of you could really take this, but is there anyone in particular who would like to start us off talking about REDD+? I will go to Barbara. I know that you have to leave us a little bit early, so if you would like to speak to this, then I'll pass it to you.
Sure. And forgive me, say really quickly what the two questions were.
The first question was, are we only talking about REDD+ here? And the second question was essentially if the funding isn't coming to REDD+ projects through carbon offsetting, what will happen to those projects?
Great. So my concern is not just REDD+. So I and others have looked at the quality of credits across many different project types, and the quality challenges are widespread across voluntary and compliance markets. With REDD+, there's an additional, or more so, there's a human rights risk issue, which makes it even more compelling to move away from an offsetting approach. And for projects, what we've seen is that with REDD, there's really widespread overcrediting, and those credits, for the most part, should not be used as offsetting today. And a contributions approach creates a way for, or maybe opens the door for companies and others to look at the wide variety of REDD+ projects on the ground, and look at which ones are really more worth supporting, and recalculating the emissions benefit, or just using it as a contribution. And that's just to say, I think with REDD, there's some really wonderful projects, and then there's really a gamut of outcomes for people and for the climate from these different projects.
Laura, perhaps you would want to speak on this, just because as someone from a very forested country, which is where a lot of REDD+ projects are based, I think this is probably pertinent for you.
Okay, I don't want to sound so negative, but we've had an ongoing project to have legally recognized lands of Indigenous peoples. The Arena Land Titling, the ALT project, with funding from Norway. This started in 2013. 10 years later, we are still to get it, past halfway of the project. Because for REDD+ projects to be successful, it has required, there is, enhanced legislation, a reform of legislation where it's needed, or a complete legal reform, a strong and strengthening of the legal reform, or restructuring it. So it has been a challenge in having what might be successful REDD+ projects. In the meantime, though, there has been an increase in concessions being granted over lands, mostly also over territories of Indigenous peoples. And as I said, I'm sorry that I cannot show you this map, that maybe I should have sent it to you, because as Indigenous peoples, we also have solutions where we have been working with communities to map out territories of Indigenous peoples, of our lands then, that we use and occupy, that are important to us, and that also as Indigenous peoples, if these legal recognition can be granted over territories of our lands, it is going to contribute to us as a country protecting our forests, our natural habitats, keeping our waters healthy, and all of these things. So might any funding coming from the carbon trade, the carbon markets, would that affect us? It should not affect projects that are already ongoing at the moment for Guyana, because there is financing that is still to be expended. again, so it raises the question of what is it? Well, where is the gap then that there has not been a successful implementation of projects in the country? There are some where monies have been spent, but the actual projects are still to be seen. So, for example, internet connectivity to the hinterland region. There was such a project allocated, so there's a project outlined in the previous, our low carbon development strategy plan. The communities are still to really get a proper internet connectivity in the hinterland. So again, it brings back the question of where there have been these grand plans globally that come to the country, but again, ownership and inclusion of indigenous peoples need to be part and parcel of the driving force of the design and project implementations and programs, if indigenous peoples are so informed and if we give or withhold our consent. And all of those need to be there to ensure whether these whole carbon trade and whether it's the offset, if these are really working for us, indigenous peoples also need to understand and be able to say whether they give consent to such programs like this that our national, the government gets involved in, coming from what is there in the global space.
Thank you, Laura. Pedro, I'll just go to you because you've got your hand up there.
Yeah, very quickly. First, to agree with Barbara, historically, this is not, let's put it this way, REDD+ is just one of many categories of projects that have had problems identified. And we've seen with industrial gases, with renewable energy, we've seen problems related to additionality, etc. On the other hand, REDD and just generically nature-based solutions are, first of all, they're starved of finance elsewhere, much more so than, for instance, renewable energy, which in fact is one of the reasons why many claim that renewable energies in many geographies are no longer additional. They are effectively already cost-effective. That's not the case for nature-based solutions, not the case for many REDD activities where you don't have any other revenue but carbon. And so what's really crucial is that when we reform the REDD+ pipeline, we address issues of baselining. And I think that those are being addressed, at least in the prospect of being addressed. But we also address issues of free prior informed consent from indigenous peoples. And personally, I would love to see indigenous peoples and their representatives actually take ownership, put it this way, of the project development, of project monitoring, so that we are not faced with this type of accusations, put it this way, and in the end, that we live up to this idea that the indigenous peoples are the guardians, so to speak, of the forest, and so they should be the ones getting the rewards.
Thanks, Pedro. The next question we have is from Teresa Anderson, who says, the World Bank's annual State of Carbon Markets reports, which they stopped publishing in 2013, showed that less than 0.1% of global carbon market value went to communities on the ground. Do you have a sense that these numbers are still consistent today? Barbara, I wonder if you could kick us off with that one.
And I'll pass on that because I haven't really looked at the flow of funds.
Can I just correct it's changed its name, but the report is still happening. There's an annual report called State and Trends. I think currently it's called State and Trends of Carbon Pricing. I don't know the latest figures for the benefits accruing to indigenous peoples, but bear in mind that since 2013 until now, as a whole, the crediting market has collapsed pretty much. Even now, we're at much smaller volumes than the ones during the clean development mechanism. So my expectation would just typically, and without doing any calculation, would be that the numbers have actually gone down just simply because the carbon market itself has gone down in volume.
We've probably got time for a couple more questions if we're relatively quick. I will go. So I haven't been saying people's names, but you know who you are if we've said your questions. I've got one here from Fatima Bakhtari, who's asking about Article 6 carbon markets. So this is an interesting one. We've not really touched on this. Could you please share your views on Article 6? With regards to the challenges of using carbon offsets, is this new carbon market? Are these new carbon markets going to be an improvement, a chance for reform? What do you think? Kaya, I think we've not heard from you for a while. Perhaps you could speak to this.
Yeah, so I think in general, we have an issue where a lot of our modeling, like our global modeling, and then our kind of assumptions as to what can be claimed in NDCs and the voluntary carbon market are not talking to each other. And I think that we've made a bit of progress in Article 6, but I don't think that we're anywhere near making the kind of progress that would make us comfortable that there's not going to be double counting. I mean, I think, and this is very political and it's very difficult. And I personally don't think that this is going to be resolved through the UNFCCC process. That's just my personal view, that that we need to be really diligent in the private sector about this, assuming that a lot of land is going to be claimed in NDCs that people are going to also want to claim in the private market. I spoke with my my physics professor, the director of my institute, who was kind of the originator of the term net zero. And he was like, I almost want to call a recall on that term because of the way it's being used. Because when we kind of put that forward, we didn't realize that the kind of modeling that was going to be relied on in terms of, the UNFCCC process and what people could claim in terms of land and the removables available through land, which are, let's be honest, a lot of removals that are being modeled are happening because of previous emissions, right? Previous emissions are leading to the kind of increased uptake through nature and so that's a huge problem if we're kind of counting on those rates, but it's actually historical emissions and we're kind of casting that forward. I think there's a huge issue in translation of science here. And we should be assuming that there's going to be quite a bit of double counting and I'm not really sure that trusting nationally determined. I mean, our NDCs are not even incomparable units, right? Some countries are reporting their NDCs in gigawatt hours, so that doesn't even make sense to translate that into the land use problem. So I guess what I would say is only what we've all been saying. If you're going to be buying offsets through a private mechanism, here's just one more thing to be diligent of. Is it being counted in a nationally determined contribution already?
I should just say I should have explained what Article 6 is for anyone not in the know. It's the new, it covers the new UN carbon markets, which includes trading in carbon credits, and NDCs are climate targets set by countries which may use these credits to reach their targets. We'll just go quickly to Pedro, and then I think we'll do one final question, and then that'll be the end.
Yeah, I just wanted to explain a little bit. The Article 6 essentially allows for anything that is mitigation to be translated into a common unit. And I agree totally with Kaya. There's going to be a lot of strange conversions into that common unit. But the idea is that just like in the Kyoto Protocol days, you could have international emissions trading between countries. Inherently, there's nothing particularly wrong as long as, this made it to the final agreement, as long as you don't double count. So within countries or across countries, if I am transferring, as the article says, a mitigation outcome to another country, I cannot any longer claim that against my NDC. And that's what a corresponding adjustment is. Now, there is a huge debate, and I sense that I'm probably again in the minority here within this group, about whether that particular requirement of corresponding adjustments should apply when say Pedro Barata goes and buys carbon credits from a project in Brazil and then wants to claim that he is neutral in Portugal. Now, strictly speaking, and I'm going to be very very Teutonic here. Strictly speaking, there is no double counting because using the voluntary carbon market, because the Brazilian reduction will show up if it is a reduction, if it's additional, et cetera, will show up in the national inventory. But I'm not counting anything towards the national inventory of Portugal. The Portuguese government is none the wiser. There are, however, real issues, and we've had several discussions within ICVCM as to how to deal with this, which is about incentives. If we have a lot of private finance going to Brazil to get, let's say, their hands on these opportunities, will that displace Brazilian-owned domestic action? More so than the question about the offset use for myself, which is a different claims perspective. So the jury is out on that, and both ICVCM and VCMI have joined hands in trying to solve that, but I can already anticipate this is going to be an extremely difficult issue.
Thanks, Pedro. And as it is fall, we are going to have to bring this to a close. So I'm going to ask one final question, and I wonder if all four panelists could, in 30 seconds or less, come up with an answer to it, if at all possible. So the question is from Patrick Greenfield, who said, given the abject failure of carbon market industry leaders to provide credibility, is it right that those that have overseen this mess continue to try to find a solution, or are they simply not up to the job? Barbara.
Thanks. So, as I said at the very beginning, I've studied carbon offset quality for 20 years. I'm having the same conversations now about poor quality that I had 20 years ago. And I think technically it's possible to have a quality market where it's independent researchers who help write the methodologies and the verification process is done independently. But after this amount of time and after such high levels of poor quality, I really think I'm not optimistic about being able to fix it now. And I think we need to move to an entirely different approach. And let me just say, I'm happy to answer emails via email that we didn't get to in the Q&A. Feel free to email me.
Thanks, Barbara. Kaya?
Yeah, I guess I would just say that I think that we saw a boom and bust cycle in the kind of early 2000s, like 2011. And I think that the folks at the VCMI and ICVCM have been working really hard to, see that there was a boom around the time that Greta, people even called it the Greta effect, which I think she would hate. Greta was speaking up and there was a huge boom in the voluntary carbon market. People were buying lots, and then there was lots of concern over greenwashing, and now we're seeing it contract again. And I really appreciate that people are like, look, we cannot afford money to stop flowing into mitigation projects. And I think that was, Pedro's comment at the start. We need every bit we can get, and we need to reduce emissions very quickly. And so I just want to be clear that at Oxford, we're not saying stop investing in reduction in parts of the world that need that financing now. I think the fundamental debate is whether the market is fit for purpose, or whether there are more creative ways to do that mitigation and to invest in the removals and storage that we need. We need between 2 and 4 gigatons annually until 2050. We're nowhere near that amount. Our state of removals report shows that. So, either way, we need to fix how many removals are in the market and add a lot of removals with long-term storage to the market, or find other ways of financing it, just as we need to find other ways of financing mitigation efforts. I really think that whatever you do, if you decide that markets are your approach, that's kind of like an ideological position, or if you find another way of doing that, we need to be very diligent in how we invest. The last thing I'll say, and I've said it before, is that you don't wash your hands of something once you've invested. You have to watch and steward and curate it and make sure communities are involved. And I think that we can, if we incentivize companies to also set nature targets alongside their net zero targets, biodiversity targets, if we think holistically in terms of our sustainability outcomes, and if we incentivize companies by rewarding them for their contributions outside of their own little big inventory challenge, then I think we can start reframing this discussion. But I really just want to say I appreciate everyone's efforts because they all come from a position of wanting higher integrity.
Thanks, Kaya. Laura?
You're muted,
I think
Laura.
Laura.
You're still muted, Laura. Thank you.
I'm sorry. I'm so sorry about that. I would really wish for Indigenous peoples representatives and, a large scale of representatives to be able to speak to these things coming from Indigenous peoples. It's not that I'm not saying I don't have the right to speak on what is happening because we work with communities, but I go back to respect for rights of Indigenous people, the right to be informed, included in informed consent, so that we are able to articulate how all of these different global programs, plans can also be reflected in the country level, but really what we should be taking to the international level based on what should be very progressive human rights approaches that we can hold our governments on before going forward and making commitments at the international level. Things like that, I think, can work if only we are informed properly and respect is given, because as I said, decisions that are made is impacting Indigenous people's rights, our food security, land tenure security, and everything else. Because again, what we can contribute as from our way of life need to be centered and not only focused on numbers and figures, which are important, but really it needs to be a combination of all of us on the table as partners, as important partners. Yeah.
Thanks, Laura. And finally, Pedro?
Yeah, Patrick, without taking it personally, like I said, I've been 20 years trying to fix the market. So probably according to the premise of your question, maybe I should just step down. I'll still keep going at it. But to your point, I do think that the conversation, even on carbon markets, and regardless of what Kaya just said, if we are going to have a carbon market of whatever sort, it will need more regulation. And I'm convinced that the ICVCM and VCMI and to an extent SBTI is kind of framing the demand are important steps. Are they enough? We'll have to wait and see. And most likely at some point, we will have to bring in other types of regulation. And we're already seeing, this is a market that has been going on without regulation for too long. And we're already seeing some interventions very recently from financial regulators and others around that lack of regulation. So so maybe I need to step down and some other regulator comes in and I can move elsewhere. Thank you very much.
Well, on that note, thank you very much to all four of our panelists. I think everyone can agree that was a very interesting discussion, and genuinely we heard a lot of different perspectives and a lot of different points. And the thing is, we've actually had far too many questions come in. Clearly people are very engaged with this. If possible, and Barbara has already alluded to this, we've got a long list of questions and we will direct those to our panelists, and there's absolutely no pressure at all. But if the mood takes you to respond to any of those questions, we can include them we'll do a quick write-up of this webinar afterwards, so we can include your responses in that. But yeah, thank you once again. And just to say, this is marking the end of a week-long series that Carbon Brief has done on carbon offsets. Please check out all of the pieces we've been working on. We've got lots of original analysis, explainers. If any of the words mentioned in that webinar were confusing to you, we have a glossary to help you understand all the different terms involved. But yeah, thank you once again, and yeah, goodbye. Have a wonderful day.